For centuries, Rome was not only a military empire, it was a monetary one. Its power did not rest solely on legions, fortifications, or conquest. It rested on trust. Trust in law, trust in administration, and above all, trust in its money. The Roman silver denarius was not merely a coin used for daily transactions. It was an invisible system that bound the empire together. It moved across borders, crossed cultures, and connected distant provinces to a single economic center. For a long time, that system worked with remarkable stability. Early Roman finances were disciplined by necessity. Taxes existed, but they were limited. Military campaigns were costly, but episodic. Expansion generated plunder, tribute, and new sources of revenue. The costs of empire were still anchored to real gains. Power expanded, but it expanded within economic limits. Then Rome grew larger, and scale changed everything. As territory expanded, obligations multiplied, borders became longer and harder to defend, armies shifted from temporary levies to permanent institutions. Soldiers no longer returned to farms after campaigns. They remained under arms year-round, requiring steady pay, food, equipment, and logistics. Bureaucracy thickened. Roads, fortifications, ports, and cities demanded continuous maintenance. The imperial machine could no longer pause. It had to operate without interruption. This created a structural problem Rome had never faced at this magnitude. Expenses became permanent. Revenues did not. The traditional tools of state finance were no longer sufficient. Raising taxes too aggressively risked unrest and rebellion. Cutting military spending risked losing control over distant provinces. Both options threatened the stability of the system itself. That left a third path. At first, it seemed technical, almost harmless, a small reduction in the silver content of the denarius. There was no announcement, no public debate. The coin looked the same. Its face value remained unchanged. Officially, nothing had altered. But the promise embedded in the metal had shifted. Each coin now contained slightly less silver than before. This was not done out of ignorance. It was done out of necessity. By issuing more coins with less precious metal, the state could meet its obligations without confronting its limits directly. Soldiers were paid, suppliers were compensated, administration continued to function. In the short term, the system appeared stable, even efficient. But money is not just a medium of exchange. It is a record of trust. Markets responded quietly at first. Prices adjusted upward. Merchants demanded more coins for the same goods. Soldiers noticed that their wages purchased less than before. The change was gradual, but cumulative. Trust did not collapse in a moment. It thinned over time. Rome did not fall when this began. But something fundamental had shifted. Money was no longer a stable anchor, reflecting real value. It had become a tool for absorbing cost. And once a state begins using money to manage structural pressure rather than represent economic reality, it enters a new phase of power, one that allows expansion to continue, but at the price of long-term fragility. Once the stability of Roman money began to erode, the consequences did not arrive as a single shock. They accumulated, slowly, unevenly, almost invisibly at first. This is what makes inflation historically dangerous. It rarely announces itself as a crisis. It presents itself as continuity. Each reduction in silver content allowed the state to buy time. Obligations were met. Armies stayed loyal. Administration continued to function. On the surface, the system appeared intact. But beneath that surface, incentives were shifting. Prices began to rise, not dramatically at first, just enough to be noticed by those closest to the market. Merchants adjusted quietly, contracts shortened, long-distance trade became riskier. A coin received today might not hold the same value tomorrow. Trust, once weakened, does not vanish all at once. It fragments. Different regions began to respond differently. In urban centers, money continued to circulate, but at accelerating volume. In rural provinces, people turned inward. Grain was stored rather than sold. Barter became more common. Local exchange replaced imperial integration. The monetary system that had once unified the empire began to splinter. The state responded in the way large systems often do when coordination fails. With control, price regulations were introduced, professions were fixed, tax obligations became hereditary. If money could no longer reliably organize economic behavior, law would attempt to enforce it. These measures were not irrational. They were compensatory. They existed to preserve output and stability when voluntary coordination weakened. But control is not a substitute for trust. It is a signal that trust is already gone. The army, Rome's backbone, felt these changes acutely. Soldiers were still paid, but their wages lost purchasing power. To compensate, the state increasingly paid in kind: food, clothing, land promises. This reduced dependence on unstable currency, but it also marked a shift away from a monetary economy toward a managed one. The system was adapting, but adaptation came at a cost. As monetary reliability declined, the state relied more heavily on volume. More coins were minted, not because the economy was growing, but because existing obligations had to be met with weaker units. This created a feedback loop. More coins chased the same goods. Prices rose further, confidence declined further. At this stage, inflation was no longer an emergency response. It had become structural. This is the critical transition. When inflation becomes embedded in a system, it stops solving temporary problems and starts managing permanent ones. It allows the state to postpone hard decisions. It spreads cost across time rather than confronting it directly. Rome was no longer using money to measure value. It was using money to absorb pressure. The empire did not collapse immediately because of this. In fact, it survived for generations. But the nature of its survival changed. Economic integration weakened. Central authority relied increasingly on coercion. The distance between the imperial center and everyday economic life widened. Rome still had legions, but it no longer had a stable monetary foundation beneath them. And once that foundation is gone, power becomes heavier, slower, and more brittle, even if it continues to project strength from a distance. The collapse of Roman money is often treated as a historical curiosity. A symptom, a footnote, something that followed the real causes of decline. But it was not peripheral, it was structural. Rome's monetary breakdown did not destroy the empire overnight. What it destroyed was the mechanism that allowed a vast system to coordinate itself without constant force. Once that mechanism failed, everything else became heavier, slower, and more fragile. This is the deeper lesson. Money is not just a tool for exchange. It is a technology of coordination. When money is trusted, complex systems can function with minimal coercion. Taxes are paid. Soldiers are supplied. Trade flows across distances. People plan for the future. When money loses credibility, coordination must be replaced by administration, obligation, and enforcement. Rome shows us what that transition looks like. As the denarius lost its role as a reliable store of value, the economy retreated from abstraction. People favored land over currency, goods over contracts, local exchange over imperial integration. The state responded by formalizing control, but control can only substitute trust up to a point. The empire became administratively dense, but economically brittle. This pattern is not unique to Rome. It repeats whenever the cost of maintaining power exceeds what an economy can sustain transparently. Rome did not invent inflation, it inherited it. What it did was normalize it. Debasement shifted from an emergency measure to a governing practice. Once that shift occurred, the relationship between the state and time changed. Costs could be postponed, obligations could be rolled forward, pressure could be diffused across generations who had never consented to the original decisions. This is where Rome becomes modern. The legacy of its monetary collapse is not confined to antiquity. It appears again whenever states face permanent expenses they cannot easily reduce. Standing armies, bureaucracies, infrastructure, security. Once these costs become structural, money is often asked to absorb what politics cannot. Inflation, in this context, is not chaos. It is management. That does not make it harmless. It makes it subtle. Rome's citizens did not wake up one day to find their world gone. They adapted. They adjusted. They endured. But each adaptation moved economic life further from trust and closer to obligation. Over time, that shift reshaped society itself. Savings lost meaning, long-term planning weakened. Economic life narrowed. What remained was power without elasticity, authority that could command, but not coordinate efficiently. This is why Rome's fall feels gradual in hindsight. The system continued to operate, but at declining quality. Empires rarely collapse because they run out of soldiers. They collapse because they run out of reliable ways to organize value. Rome's monetary system once allowed a vast territory to function as a single economic space. When that system degraded, unity became administrative rather than organic. The empire survived in name, in law, and in force. But the economic glue that made it resilient was gone. This is why Rome still matters. Its story reminds us that financial systems are not neutral. They are the foundations on which power rests. When those foundations are altered to postpone structural limits, the consequences unfold slowly, but relentlessly. Rome did not fall because it misunderstood money. It fell because it asked money to do what no system can do forever: absorb costs without consequence. History leaves patterns. Understanding them changes how you see the present.